Welcome everybody to the second of our 3 seminars on African swine fever. I would like to thank our sponsors today, the Victorian Farmers Federation, Australian Pork Limited and Agriculture Victoria, who are sponsoring this project through the Enhancing Biosecurity and Animal Welfare project delivered by the VFF. Today we have 2 excellent speakers from Apium Animal Health. They are Chris Richards and Dr. Bree Fredericks. Remember to enter any questions in the dialogue box and we'll try to get to them at the end of the talks. Our first speaker today is Chris Richards. Chris founded Chris Richards and Associates in 1998 as a pig-specific veterinary clinic based in Bendigo, servicing clients throughout Australia. Chris has been responsible for the strategic direction of the group, which has seen the development, acquisition and integration of other production animal veterinary clinics, veterinary wholesale, logistics and genetic service businesses over the past 18 years. It's a real success story. Chris is a member of APL's Biosecurity Strategic Review Panel, is a member of the Pork CRC Research and Development Committee, and in my view, has extraordinary global networks. Just the thing for ASF. Chris.
Thanks, Ross. So welcome everybody, and thanks to the VFF for providing this opportunity, particularly Tim Kingma for the invitation to speak today. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview on biosecurity and how we put together biosecurity programs, how Australian biosecurity programs have been set up now and what we're really trying to achieve with them, and then I'll introduce a focus on what we need to be doing for ASF. My talk's going to be then followed by Bree, who's going to look at really what biosecurity program we need to be in the event that we have more of a challenge with ASF and it actually does enter the country. So I'll start off just with this cartoon, and it's really highlighting the fact that things are changing in our world, and particularly when it comes to biosecurity programs. And one of the things that I think is really changing is that we have to really start living a biosecurity culture, which is a lot different to putting up a fence and having a showering facility. So if we look at what biosecurity, what does it mean? Well, it comprises all the measures that we undertake to minimise the risk of introduction and spread of infectious agents. And by taking these measures, we'll protect our animals against diseases in the best possible way. And the reason we say the best possible way is because even with an excellent management program, it's impossible to achieve zero risk of disease outbreaks. So when we're putting together a biosecurity program, we have to look at what are the real main risks and then offset or take into consideration the costs that might be associated in putting a program together. So I like to use the analogy of an onion, and if we have our farm sitting in the middle of that onion, we can put lots of layers or rings of actions in place around that farm in order to protect it. But every time we put an additional layer, we put an additional cost. So we've got to make sure that when we do a biosecurity program, we're really focusing on what are the real key risks are. And we don't have to necessarily do a lot to reduce the risks. So if we look at this decision tree, this is really an example of a trailer or a trailer on a truck, and that being an infected trailer that carries an agent. And if, for example, what you do is bring gilts into a farm. So when you go down the decision tree and you look at it and you say, if we can actually reduce the number of times that trailer comes to a farm, or if we can make sure it doesn't actually come in contact with the farm, we can remove the risk. If we remove the risk, then it's our greatest chance of actually keeping out whatever that risk is. In the event that we can't totally reduce the risk, but we do have to bring that trailer, into a farm, then the next step is, is that trailer contaminated? If it's not contaminated, because we've done something to make sure it's not contaminated, then we've taken away the risk. But in the event that we haven't been able to do that, then the risk continues, and then we look at the last bit to see, does that pathogen that's on a trailer, does it get into our herd? So the best way to look at this, as I said, is with gilts. And if we say guilt entries into a farm, if a trailer enters a farm 10 times a year, if 1 out of 50 times that trailer happens to be contaminated with a virus, and every time that it's contaminated with a virus, it contaminates the pigs and infects the herd. If you look at the numbers, the risk of that pathogen entering the herd is 1 time every 5 years. But if, for example, we do a few things to reduce that risk, we can extend that period. So, for example, instead of delivering gilts in 10 times a year, if we bring them in 5 times a year, if we disinfect the trailer so that the risk is only 1 out of every 100 times that the trailer is contaminated, and if it's only 50% of the time the virus transfers from the trailer to the gilts into the herd because we've isolated gilts in quarantine, then that risk changes from 1 in 5 years to 1 in 40 years. So if you look at that, there's only really 3 key things that have changed. And all 3 of those are really things that are easy to change. And the reason we can have such an impact is because we've identified as those 3 things as being the 3 main risks with bringing disease in through gilts. So when we're looking at biosecurity programs, we really need to know what are the higher risk things that we put our money into versus the lower risk things that potentially we don't get the return that we need. So typically, if you look at high risk activities of bringing diseases into piggeries, it's usually live animals. So particularly in Australia, where most of our diseases are bacterial, and the bug doesn't survive outside the animal for usually more than a few days, if a few hours, then bringing in live animals is our biggest risk. Some viruses, it's coming in with pork products. If you look beyond that, then people, and particularly material, fecal material, other material that's on people, clothes, boots, hands, that's another risk. Transport vehicles are a high risk. But then when you get down to the other end of the scale and you look at equipment and rodents and things like that, yeah, they're definitely a risk with certain diseases, but they're not the highest risks of bringing stuff into a piggery. So this again, you've got to look at each individual pathogen. So, because in the case of African swine fever, feed has become a higher risk. So it's about looking at specifically what you're trying to keep out and what you need to do to put a program in place. If we look at the key elements of herd biosecurity, again, there's 4 areas that we want to look at, and I've virtually just gone through them. But looking at how we move pigs and animals and semen, depending upon what the pathogen is we're trying to keep out, how we manage carcasses and manure and pest control, how we manage water, feed and bedding, and then how we look at people movement and contamination from fomites, from equipment, vehicles, things like that. And with all these, there's obviously things you can do to reduce those risks. What I want to talk about today is the real important thing about implementing these and making sure that they're occurring all the time is that it's really about this biosecurity culture and getting engagement and competency. So staff training is really critical in when you're looking at a biosecurity culture. So, just because we have a fence doesn't mean that we necessarily have good biosecurity. It's got to be something that's lived on a daily basis. So, as I said, you can have a fence, but if it's left open, then the biosecurity program's really not that good at all. So there's lots of training material that's out there, whether it's available through veterinary groups or industry or the OIE. Lots of training programs, whether they're through paper-based or online learning. But for me, what's really critical is not just having having a training program, but making sure that it's a competency-based training program, and that people are actually expressing competency at the other end of it, which means that they're doing biosecurity every day, and that they're really adopting a high biosecurity culture. So if we look at how good are we at biosecurity in Australia, I think we're fairly reactionary, and that we live systems based on personal experience. And So if you see, and what I really mean by that is that whenever we have a scare, we do things. So when influenza, the pandemic influenza came into Australia, suddenly we started testing temperatures. We started different protocols because of that. That's something that's happened. When African swine fever hit East Timor, we started to suddenly realise it was nearby. So we started to up-ramp our biosecurity systems. When it happened in the Philippines, we suddenly looked at people coming back from the Philippines and whether we should increase our protocols there. And now that it's into Papua New Guinea, suddenly there's a big focus on feral pigs and fencing. So we're very, very reactionary, and it's because we implement systems based on our personal experience and the threat that we personally consider it to ourselves. And we're no different to other countries either. So if you look at biosecurity in other countries that have some of these viruses, they have more advanced biosecurity systems because they have the viruses and they've had to react due to what's in their backyard. And, PED is a good example of this in the US, which prior to PED, there were no truck washers and no truck heaters or cookers. But then they very much identified that one of the big risks was carting the virus back from an abattoir. So suddenly now everyone's got truck washers and it's standard protocol. But again, very, very reactionary, waiting for something to happen and then making the investment. So I think that if you look at how good we are, I think in Australia our experiences influence our biosecurity protocols, and in Australia we have mainly bacterial pathogens and parasites. So whether it's trying to keep these out in the first place, or whether when we do eradication programs and then we're trying to maintain that freedom, our biosecurity systems are very much aimed around bacteria, which we know don't last very long outside of the animal. So how we're really measured? Well, we're measured because of APIC. So, the APIC standards are very well designed for keeping out bacterial pathogens. There's no doubt about that, and we've been very successful. Farms that apply these standards and live these standards have been very successful in keeping these pathogens out. But with the APIC standards, they are something that is measured once a year. In some cases, with internal audits, they might be 2 or 3 times a year. But they're not something that's necessarily measured on a daily basis, and they are very subjective based on the skill set of who is undertaking the assessment. So if we look at pathogens that we don't base our biosecurity protocols on, and they're all viruses, and I said that's probably because we haven't had a lot of experience with them. So I mentioned swine influenza. I mean, when we had the pandemic, everyone reacted very quickly. We still have probably half a dozen at least outbreaks of swine influenza in piggeries every winter now, and in nearly every case, it's because a human who's been sick's come into the piggery and infected a pig. So we know that's the method that it always happens, but we continue to have breakdowns because of that happening. So if we're going to have to change the way that we think about viruses and what systems that we put in place. If we look at something like PCV, we always had PCV, but we never saw the clinical disease that we saw when it started really taking off in Australia, and where we'd get 30% post-weaning mortality, and very quickly within 3 years, every farm has basically been infected by that virus. Now, it's no different to any other country. I'm just saying that we just haven't been very good at keeping viruses out of Australia when they've occurred, and neither have other industries, our other farming industries as well. They still get virus outbreaks. If we look at all the other diseases, viruses which are exotic to Australia, again, some producers have very good systems and certainly have systems that will keep viruses out, and they tend to be producers who have built piggeries at the start of when all the emphasis was happening on PRRS in the US. They went and they had a look at what systems needed to be built, and they built those systems. So we've got plenty of those around Australia, but we've got plenty as well that aren't built for those viruses. So how do others measure themselves? Well, in the US, there's a program called PADRAP developed out of Iowa State, and it was very much developed to look at biosecurity risks of PRRS and keeping that virus out of US piggeries. So it's a very objective assessment. You put everything in, it gives you a score on how successful a biosecurity system you have. We use to do our assessments the BioCheck system, which is out of the University of Ghent in Belgium. So again, that is a program that's very much driven around good biosecurity systems for not just bacteria but viruses as well. And to give you an idea, and it gives a score. To give you an idea, most farms that we assess that are APIC accredited tend to start off at about a 65–70% mark on BioCheck. And then through that system, they identify where their gaps are, and then they'll start to improve that score over time. And that is a really important thing about biosecurity, is it is a continuing improvement process, and that we're just continually reducing the risk over time through various measures. So I think the summary for me there is that it's a lot easier to have effective biosecurity programs when you don't have the disease in the country. And when you do have the disease in the country, then the biosecurity systems seem to be a lot more detailed, and a lot more layers get put in place. So I think that's something that we really need to think about is, are we going to be reactionary, or should we be investing in some of those systems in the event that ASF or another virus does come into Australia? And the reason viruses are so hard to keep out is because they're pretty infectious and they move around very quickly. And I'll just give you an example here. This was some work that Scott D did in the US, pretty sure when he was at Minnesota, and it's this snowball effect where he got a snowball and he injected some PRRS virus in it. He then shoved that back up in his wheel well. He drove to a car wash. He power washed it off and let that snowball hit the ground. He stepped on that snowball. He then got in his vehicle and he drove 6 hours to his home. He went in his front door and he took his boots off. He then took the boots away and there was a small pool of water. He then put a cardboard box on there and he put a polystyrene box and he swabbed them, and 8 out of 10 were positive for the PRRS virus. So viruses move around, and you don't need too many virus particles with some of these diseases to get infection. So ASF is probably one where you do need a few virus particles, but there's plenty of viruses out there that you really don't need too many at all. So for us to get biosecurity focused, we really need to get virus focused. And we've got to keep Australia ASF free. We've got to keep it that way. One thing I'll say is I think our border security systems that we've got in place are fantastic. I think they really do work. And we're quite fortunate in that we have one of the most advanced biosecurity systems, which really targets where our high risks are of bringing in the virus into Australia. So our biosecurity systems at our borders definitely work. What we need to do is look at what are the few things that we can really focus on a farm level to keep ASF out of a farm in the event that it did get through that biosecurity system. So when you look at what are those things that we have to do, the important thing is to look at what are the factors that affect survival of ASF when it gets outside a pig. And so if we look at things like time and temperature, that can guide us in terms of what we need to be doing. ASF is a virus where as you increase time and you increase temperature, the virus dies a lot quickly. So we also need to look at how the virus survives in different feed ingredients or meat products, and a lot of work that's been done in the US at Kansas State and Minnesota and at Pipestone. That all this data is published, and then we also need to look at the properties of the virus. So we've got a lot of information on how to make assessments and put in a good biosecurity program. So if I look at the three key priorities that we believe that we should be focusing on, again, it's all about what's the risk. You can do lots of things, but these are the three that we need to focus on while we don't have the virus in the country. Okay. So pork products, so reducing, actually eliminating pork products from coming into piggeries, and I'll talk to that in a minute. Having a downtime or quarantine period for any imported feed ingredients, and we can talk a little bit about how long that is. And then reducing the risk of people who have come from ASF positive countries, and particularly if they've been on farms. So if we look at the first one, banning pork products from your piggery, I hear a lot of debate from people saying, well, what about if I just provide pork from my own farm? For me, a biosecurity culture has zero tolerance. And so rather than try and grey the lines between, whether it's my farm or someone else's farm or whether it's imported or whatever it is, how about just zero? If you take the risk away totally, you have no risk. So, I like implementing a ban on all pork products in the farm. And I think it's important in training exercises to actually outline what all the pork products are, because people sometimes forget that, salads can have pork in them and different things like that. The second one is around quarantine on feed ingredients. And, in terms of a quarantine period, it really comes down to what ingredients that you're getting and where they're coming from. And so my message here is know where your product comes from and how long it's been in transit. So I have here 10 weeks, and 10 weeks for us is if you don't know, then you should apply a 10-week quarantine. But if your feed mill or your feed ingredient supplier has more certainty around where the products come from and how it's been treated, then you might be able to reduce that period. The third one is around managing farm access. So again, people don't necessarily bring it in. They bring it in on clothes. They bring it in on usually organic material, feces and things like that might come in. So again, if you just implement a policy that says I'm not going to bring anyone on the farm if they've been 7 days in an ASF country, then you just eliminate that risk. And so it's a pretty simple thing to be able to do. So some of the other farm biosecurity considerations that we should have, managing feral pigs, we just need to keep them out. Okay. Swill feeding, probably more of a message around backyard pig producing and smallholders, but we can't be swill feeding at all. And then when it comes to disinfectants, just make sure your disinfectant is effective against ASF. And the good news is there's lots that are. So, when we don't have the virus in Australia, then basically any disinfectant that is effective against ASF or a whole list of pathogens is what we should be using. If we do have ASF in Australia, then we need to take a bit more consideration around kill time and duration of efficacy and all those things if you're going to be continually reinfecting an environment. So what can we do on our farms every day? Well, make sure that we've got the basics right. Have we got clean and dirty zones clearly demarcated? Are we managing footwear and clothing at that dirty-clean boundary? Are hand washing and sanitation facilities satisfactory? And what I mean is it actually easy to wash your hands? Is there always soap available or always sanitizer available or something so it's easy? Because these the lapses in biosecurity programs are usually when it's difficult to achieve what we're trying to achieve. Putting a ban on pork products, making sure that there's compliance with biosecurity quarantine times, and really importantly is regularly reviewing your current farm biosecurity practices. And the reason I really want to emphasise that is because if you look at the Ghent University Biocheck program, they actually put out a lot of reports around the systems that are involved in undergoing that assessment. And there's a few correlations that are definitely keep showing up. So one is that people who continually review their biosecurity practices continually improve their biosecurity practices. But if they don't do it, then they lapse. The second thing is that, and both the systems, the online systems show this, is they also assess internal biosecurity and how you move from one area to another area in your farm. And there's a direct correlation between your ability to adhere to internal biosecurity and how well you're really doing external biosecurity. So reviewing biosecurity practices is ongoing, is pretty important, particularly if we want to continue to improve those systems. So I'd say consider an on-farm biosecurity system. All vets will be able to conduct a thorough on-farm audit and review the key protocols, and more importantly, to focus on those areas of key impact and making sure that there's a solid foundation and good biosecurity plan in place. And again, and maintain an ongoing review program. So continually undergoing another biosecurity audit every 3 months or every 6 months to make sure that there's continual improvement occurring. So that's really an overview of how we put together biosecurity programs, what the main risks are for us in Australia, and what we can do when we don't, when currently we don't have the virus in Australia. What Bree's going to talk next, and Ross will do a bit of an introduction, but Bree's now going to take it to the next step and say, well, if you did have a virus in your country, what will you need to do to actually keep it out of your farm? In other words, what are they doing in other countries around the world to keep ASF out of piggeries, even when they have endemic ASF in their countries?
Thank you. Welcome, Bree Frederick. Bree is a 2016 Doctor of Veterinary Medicine graduate from the University of Tennessee in the USA. She relocated to Australia to join Apium in December 2019. She was previously employed in the US by Mashofs, one of the largest swine integrators in the country. We were speaking before, and Bree was saying that they had about 230,000 sows while she was working with them. While in the US, she provided veterinary oversight to 55,000 sows and their associated wean-to-market growouts. Her special interests include day one pig care, farrowing house management, mycoplasma elimination, and biosecurity implementation. Welcome, Bree.
Thank you, Ross. Are we good on audio? Ross, if you can hear me, can you just...
Yes, I can, clearly.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you for having me today. It has been a pleasure. I know we've been a bit delayed, but I've been looking forward to this talk. Biosecurity is definitely a big priority for me personally, but also the US, just because we are plagued with quite a few different viruses. Some of them transmitted via aerosol and some of them via mechanical transmission, just like ASF. So I always look forward to discussing this one on farm, but also in a crowd like this. It's a really great opportunity. So we'll just pop through a couple of these now. Let me just get here. There we go. So good biosecurity, what is it? The funny thing is this presentation was made back in March, and this is before COVID had informed everyone across the world what biosecurity is. But I think very simply we can just say security from exposure to harmful biological agents. So that could be anything, obviously, across species or interspecies. Some of the things that I'm going to be covering today will be, to some people, I've already heard feedback that, oh, that's a bit of a stretch. We don't have the capacity for that. But I think when push comes to shove, you'll be surprised how creative you can get. And I've already kind of seen that when going out on farms, just how creative the Australian pig farmer can be. And you have a lot of ingenuity in what you're able to do on farm. So just a really high level overview. I've tried to do a little bit of research here. So the Australian pork industry, as far as the numbers that we have here, so roughly 2,700 people with 286,000 sows, which is roughly about 5.2 billion to the Australian economy. In comparison, the US pork industry, and this has changed a bit due to COVID, but we're roughly 60,000 people involved in the industry with 4.3 million, that is including Smithfield, which is based out of China as well. And then we have an industry of about 23.4 billion in our pork industry. So keep that in mind as we're going through. Some of our farms are on bigger scales, but again, biosecurity is biosecurity no matter where you are in the world. I do want to share this. So this is, I apologize for the smaller text on here, but this is a snip that I borrowed off of one of Iowa State's presentations. This is a calendar that was presented from a 2013 Iowa State diagnostic lab So what you're looking at here is in 2013 is when the U.S. was hit with PED, which is porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. So it is a coronavirus. And what you'll see is that at first it was diagnosed as several different diseases because it does present similarly to TGE and some other things that they just thought, oh, this has to be what it is. We didn't actually diagnose it in the U.S. until the 17th of March. But then the interesting thing to me is Iowa State went back and they looked at previous cases that they just had not been able to find a good diagnosis for at the time. And these are all the positive cases that popped up. So each of these designations would be states. So IA would be Iowa, for example, and then GF might be grow finish. So just some examples for you of how many different cases, when they went back and specifically started looking for it, they were able to find it on. I don't think it's any surprise by now to everyone after hearing the first set of webinar how ASF can potentially be missed because it doesn't always present the exact same way. So just keep that in mind when people are saying, oh, you know, it can't be ASF. Well, it might be good to just go ahead and take an investigation and look into it. Also for perspective, I'm just showing you here, so this is roughly where the U.S. hog market is located, so this is why biosecurity is so important to us. So in the center of the screen here, that is the outline of Iowa that has the majority of the red in it, and then along the right side there, along the percentage, you'll see that is North Carolina, so we have quite a few sow farms in that area. A lot of our farms are broken up as breed to wean, so just sow farm gestation and then all the way to weaning. And then our finishing side will often be located in Iowa, just because that's where most of our feed source is, so corn and soybeans. This is our feral swine population in the U.S. People don't like to acknowledge this, but it's a bit hard if you're not as familiar with the U.S., but Iowa is actually in a purple-free zone. However, I'll tell you that this is a bit dated. You'll see it's 2019, but I can tell you as a matter of fact that I know there are feral hogs in Illinois, for example, which is another state here in the center. And there are no purple on that line. So just keep in perspective that hogs are constantly on the move, and we have winter to help try and keep them towards the southern states. I will show you Australia's as well, but again, just giving you a crunch for numbers. So Smithfield, how we come up with all of our numbers, so we've got on here, they make up roughly 930,000 sows. Smithfield is owned by China at this point. So they have quite a bit in Russia. So some of the slides I'll show you later on will have some information of how they have dealt with it in some other countries as well when they have ASF breaks. So this is Australia. I'm sure quite a few of you have seen this. So the feral pig incidents. I have managed to make it to a few states prior to COVID lockdown going in. I haven't had the pleasure of running into any of the feral swine yet, but as I was quite surprised to see that feral hogs are quite widespread according to this map in Australia. And I think that Chris said it very well, that the key to success is being, I would call it saying proactive rather than reactive. If I'm ever on your farm, you'll hear me say that quite a bit because you really have to get ahead of it, and biosecurity is key. So these are some images from the U.S., and Chris and I are probably parroting a little bit of each other here, but so some of the farms that I would go to would say, oh yeah, we have great biosecurity, we have a fence in place, and then here's their fence on the left, right? We have a gate. So while I'm sure most people would respect their lawns, that's definitely not going to keep anything serious out. And then we do have quite a few things like chain link fences, things like this, just to keep from a safety standpoint, right? So from our lagoons and things like that, keeping any wildlife or people so that there isn't any accidents. But we don't have a lot of feral swine proofing fence currently. This, however, is a picture for you. This is in Russia. This is a veterinarian friend of mine. They have ASF all around them. They have managed to keep, this is a 20,000 head sow farm, and they have managed to keep it ASF negative. And so I asked her to forward some things through to me, and she just reminded me, Bree, pigs don't fly. They will go under. And so for them in particular, because the risk is so high, they have gone ahead and put a concrete barrier at the bottom with a fence at the top. That is obviously a very high extreme. But I think that, you know, if you're just putting something a few, 6-8 inches below ground, something like that, or putting an electric wire along the line, just there's different ways to get creative to get your perimeter fence secure. Other things that we put into place, all of this is for a viral mindset. So in addition to the fences to keep wildlife out, we ask our employees to park away from our farms. So you'll see that if we have any kind of visitors or anything that day, we always ask them to keep so many feet away. We typically have an area that's designated. I was pleasantly surprised to see that some of you have already got these signs up in your piggeries. So this is a piggery that is here in Australia, and I was thrilled when I pulled up to the piggery that day because I knew I was a visitor to the farm. I knew exactly where to go, and it just prevented me from going and wandering into areas that I did not need to be on that day. So very clear signage. Other things that we tend to have a problem with in the U.S., we have rodents, which I have encountered that Australia has quite a few as well. But we'll have things like raccoons and birds and certainly rats and mice. So a big area of biosecurity for us is the feed lines. And so we use a lot of corn and soybeans. Sometimes they bind up in the bins, and what you'll have is that once they fix the bins, you'll have these little feed spills or moldy feed that they'll knock out and they'll kind of lay on the bin pads here. So we really harp on just making sure that you're keeping things like that tidy. Another big one is vegetation. So I've tried to give you a good versus a bad, right? So rodents do not care to run along gravel or non-vegetation areas. And so our farms, we always made them keep an 8 to 10 inch barrier minimum away from the sheds or the barns to say, look, you have to keep this back to try and keep the rodents from coming in. Rodents carry a numerous amount of diseases, and while they're not listed as a primary vector for ASF, I don't think it's a stretch that if you had a feral hog die in the vicinity of your farm, what's going to dissolve that carcass, right? Is it going to be birds? Is it going to be rodents? They're going to track in different tissues and bloods, things like that, and then they could go right into your piggery. So I'm quite a big advocate on rodent and bird control, and this is just an easy step, right? Keeping the vegetation back, having a nice rock or dirt barrier to try and minimize rodent spread. Another thing would be removing garbage or harborage. So again, this is anything that could be a nice home for mice. This is obviously a farm that I went to, and they were not doing a great job. They must have been doing a clean out and they just threw it out. But in addition to keeping up the appearance of your site, think of all the disease vectors, aka rodents, that could be living in areas like this. This is my favorite. So when I hear people commenting about rodent control, a lot of times I'll see just different traps and things available. And I've seen some quite creative things since I've been in Australia. I always ask if I can take a picture and share it back home because we do things differently, and I'm intrigued and inspired by some of the things I see here. You may have these available already, but these are, we just call them T-piece rodent containers. So we just have a lid at the top where you'll see that number 12, and we can pop that on and off, and we actually station it all the way around the perimeter. We'll have these probably every 10 to 15 feet, and we just put a little rodent packet of bait along there. And it has a major effect of keeping rodents out. You'll also see some of the black boxes. We put rocks on them or some kind of weight because we have raccoons in the U.S. and they love to play with our rodent boxes. But in the red here, I'd like to point out, here's things not to do, right? So this is actually inside of a sow farm. Walking along, you'll see that because the rodent burden is so high, you do run the risk of having rodent bait carried further than the intended purpose. So quite a bit of rodent baits in the alleyway here, and obviously animals could pick that up. So we always just ask that you put it up in a curtain area or somewhere that is going to keep it safe. The other thing I would point out is I hear a lot of farms saying, oh, our rodent system is cats. There's quite a bit of data on this actually, because it is across the world. People try and use natural means instead of rodent bait, but cats are probably one of the worst means of managing rodents, in my opinion. Not only do cats carry diseases that can transmit to pigs, but the other option is that cat might kill 1 or 2 mice a day. And you have to be realistic in thinking, what is that going to do from a rodent population standpoint? This is a big one that I also am an advocate for, so bird prevention. One of the first things that I noticed when I came to Australia was going out to piggeries. There was a decent prevalence of flu, swine influenza that I observed. And just like Chris mentioned, a lot of it, you could track it back from a people spread. Someone was ill. They thought it was just a cold or sinus. They came into the farm, and then within 1 to 2 weeks, the pigs were ill. people are a primary means of spreading influenza, and avian influenza is another one. So trying to keep birds out of your piggery, they spread all kinds of diseases, and they can definitely fly from piggery to piggery, or if your neighbor down the road has a pet pig or something like that, it's an easy way for them to track things that you have no control over into your piggery. So just getting a roll of this kind of bird mesh and running it along is a great way of keeping birds out of your piggery. Signage, we have PERS and PED, so we have to be very clear, no visitors, because we just can't control downtime very well if we let tours and things like that come through for students and whatnot. So we have lots and lots of signage that if we do have people that are new to the site coming, we want to say, look, this is our main entry, everyone, we should funnel through this area so we can try to minimize risk. Another big one is we have these key code locks. I've been to a couple piggeries here that I think it's great. You guys are locking up your piggeries at night. I would just throw this out there as an option. I'm not familiar if they're widely distributed here, so I apologize if they aren't commonplace. But this is a very easy way to say, look, we do lock our piggeries up, but it's a key code access. So in the case of an emergency, it's not a padlock that someone has to get through. But it definitely does help with keeping unwanted visitors in your sheds. And again, these are just examples. We put signs everywhere. We do not want an excuse of, oh, someone that we didn't know came to the site and they walked right into the breeding shed because they had no idea where they were supposed to go. So just as many signs as you can get, just put them up. Can't have too many. I figured Chris was going to hit on this a little bit, so I didn't hit too deep in this. So our truck washes, like Chris said, PED was, I would say, a slap in the face for us. We were not prepared in 2013 when it hit, and the learning curve was steep. But we definitely have things in place that we carry on today, even despite PED being a lower prevalence. Truck washes are huge for us. ASF, like PED, is a mechanically transmitted disease. If you can keep it from coming in on people's lunches, on their person, through rodents, fencing, things like that, that's what you have to prevent, right? It's not going to blow in through the air. So even if ASF is in the country, we absolutely can keep it from spreading around. Russia has proven that to us, as have many of the European Union nations. So big thing on truck washes, like I said, Chris did a great job of hitting on it earlier. But whenever we go to an abattoir or we go to what we consider a dirty site, we pull this truck into an area, we would call it a wash bay. We power wash everything out of there. We'll actually disinfect it. Typically, well, there's different disinfectants, but we use quite a bit of Synergize. And then the last thing is for us, because of how cold it gets, we'll bake the trailer because we know that PERS, just like the snowball effect, even after you wash everything, it can still be there. So a key thing is heating that trailer or having downtime to dry it out. Drying out is a great way to kill viruses. I'm going to list a couple of these. I want to be cautious of time, so I've listed them here, but I'll go into a bit of detail as we go through. So these are all ways that if a virus were to hit tomorrow, do you have these things in place at your piggery? So simple things like Danish entry benches, or more complicated things or things that might be a bit more foreign to you, such as a fume room for bringing supplies in and out. UV light chambers, they're used in human hospitals and piggeries in other countries today. Are these common? Shower in, shower out. I know that requires some infrastructure, but how much financial input do you need for this, and do you have the facility to be able to handle this long term? Video monitoring is something we do just from a safety standpoint. Visitor sign-in, I've seen quite a bit of that on the Australian piggeries. Hand sanitizer, just a little pump depressor at the Danish entry bench. Stage loading, downtime, and catered lunches, all things that if it were to hit, these are things that we could, how long would it take if we were to say, if we want to implement it tomorrow, could we do it? So this is an example for people who aren't familiar with it of a UV chamber. So ultraviolet light we know can kill quite a few bacteria as well as viruses. It takes about 5 minutes for us to be able to kill a virus like PERS, which is a little bit more fragile. It is aerosol transmitted. Or a coronavirus like PED, which we know is mechanically transmitted and normally comes in, a little bit of manure on someone's boot or on the bottom of a lunch pail. It takes about 10 minutes, right? So this is a commercially available UV chamber, but I'll tell you that because of the cost associated with these, our farms in the U.S. Become quite adept at making them on their own. So there are some standards you need to get, certain levels of UV that need to be used. However, these are very easily made and can be custom made on your piggery. So don't feel that you have to go, and I'm not trying to advertise for this company or anything. It's certainly something that, on your piggery, we could fit it to your style. This next one is something that I'm not familiar with in Australia. I haven't come across them yet. I would say that this goes a bit more along the lines of Chris's comment on, I think Australian farms are very adept at combating bacterial diseases. This would probably be more along the viral edge. So all of our sow farms would certainly have these. So we call them fume rooms, fumigation rooms. It's just a little tiny room that's built onto the office or somewhere on the piggery that whenever a supply van backs up, it's a door on one side and the other, a walk-through basically, but we have shelves in the middle. All supplies go on these shelves. And then we use what we call them foggers, but we just use a fogger here that's filled with a certain disinfectant, depends on what you're trying to combat. And then we run this disinfectant for about 10 minutes. It soaks everything in there. And then we allow 20 minutes of downtime or contact time. And then only after that 30-minute span will we bring the supplies or the items into the piggery. Think about any time you have a contractor that has to come on your farm, if it's electrician or whatnot, think about, do you have the tools to provide them, or do they bring the tools to yourself? The biggest way that PRRS and viruses like PED would move around the U.S. is, we decided to build on extra farrowing crates or whatever the cause may be. We had a contractor out. We didn't know that at the same time they were doing a job for a guy 20 miles down the road, and his farm broke with the virus, and then he drug it to ours on his saw or on his jackhammer. Right, so this is a way for us to disinfect things coming to our piggery that normally we wouldn't have control of. An external supply or semen drop, again, this is just a generic example I can give you. So a door on one side and a door on the back side. So the semen drop would come in, there'd be a fridge in this area, they would go ahead and unload it there, and then the farm workers would never have to interact with them, and they certainly would never be coming onto farm. It's not saying there's any risk, particularly with the semen supply here in Australia, just highlighting that you want to try and keep strangers off your farm, right? Because we're not going to know the virus is here until someone pops positive. And by that point, it's already moved through X number of pigs. So we just have to get in that mindset that it's going to be here for a couple weeks, maybe longer, before we're going to find it. And when we do, how close is it to your farm? And now I have a little video that I would like to show, and this is just illustrating a commercial system in the US. They made this to try and teach as a training module. So if I can get the guys to help me out with playing the bench entry one.
Diseases such as PRRS and PEDV can be a huge setback to herd health, and biosecurity procedures greatly reduce the risk of bringing a pathogen into a farm. A bench entry system is just one of the many biosecurity practices we utilize when welcoming employees and visitors to our farms. Here is the process for entering a farm with a bench entry. Upon arrival, you'll want to make sure to put on your biosecurity shoe covers. Remember, it's one by one, without letting your foot touch the vehicle, running boards, or ground. Once you've got your shoe covers on, you'll head towards the main door of the farm. If you have a code, go ahead and enter it. Otherwise, contact the farm manager when you're outside. Place your lunch bag directly on the bench, not on the floor. If you're wearing a coat, you'll want to hang it in the main entryway. Right now, you're on the dirty side of the bench. Sit down on the bench and remove your shoes. Just make sure to not let your socks touch the ground or the opposite shoe that you're removing. Then, swing your legs across the bench. Now you're on the clean side of the bench. Go ahead and reach back over the bench and slide your shoes into the racks or compartments. Then, remove the exterior bag from your lunch and leave on the bench or dispose in the trash. Last, but certainly not least, make sure to thoroughly sanitize your hands. If you're a visitor at the farm, you'll need to present your visitor entry card to the farm manager and verify proper downtime or nights since your last exposure to pigs. Please know that the farm manager has the authority to approve or deny any visitors if they think they do not meet proper downtime or biosecurity requirements. If the farm you're at has a UV chamber, you'll place your items inside the chamber and press start. If the farm does not have a UV chamber, the farm manager will grab the items through a pass-through window. Now you're all set. It's time to head to the showers.
Yep, so I know that's eating up a bit of my time, so I'll have to skip through, but there's one other video I want to show you. But since I don't have the ability to actually take you and walk you through a farm, I'm trying to just show you how we implement some of these things. So the next video would apply more for, this is something that was produced by Iowa State, and it would be more for an outdoor piggery and how they might manage biosecurity and try and highlight some of the risks. So we'll just play that clip really quick.
Biosecurity is critical in keeping pigs healthy, and the implementation of biosecurity practices, no matter the production type, can help to reduce risk. Alternative pork production presents unique challenges for biosecurity. This video, the first in a short series, will help explain how to avoid the introduction and spread of disease on the farm. Alternative pork production is defined as farms that are non-mainstream types and may identify as niche, pasture pork, hoop barns, traditional pork, or heritage breeds, among other types of alternative production. Some alternative pork producers raise pigs without using antibiotics, except when necessary for disease treatment. Biosecurity is very important to all swine operations, but improved biosecurity is a vital management strategy to maintain herd health in the absence of antibiotic treatment. This video will focus on risk events that could bring pathogens onto the farm and illustrate how a virus spreads, regardless of how infrequent the event may occur. Risk events can be farmer, caretaker, or visitor entry onto the farm, transportation of pigs, including delivery to market, arrival of new breeding stock or weaned pigs, feed delivery, repairs by outside contractors, wildlife, such as birds, rodents, and pests. Research at Iowa State University found that some of the highest risk events related to disease outbreaks involve pathogens being carried onto a farm by people, animals, or supplies. Two of the highest risk events for alternative production are people entering the production area and delivery of hogs to market. Even feed delivery, manure removal, and outside barn repair can lead to pathogens tracked onto the farm. Thinking about biosecurity in terms of risk events helps us to focus prevention efforts. As we look for high-risk events, watch and see how pathogens may be tracked onto the farm with these demonstrations. This example shows how a vehicle or farm equipment could transfer a pathogen onto the farm. This example shows how pathogens could be picked up on the shoes of the farmer, caretaker, or visitors while off the farm. In summary, people entering production areas and delivery of hogs to market are the highest biosecurity risks for alternative pork production. In the next video, we'll focus on strategies that can help reduce those risks.
Yep, so I just wanted to put that out there for everybody because, again, one of them was definitely a more intense. That was one of our larger production systems. And then the other one is it's definitely becoming more popular in the U.S. to have some of the pasture-raised pork. And sometimes I feel like we maybe short the pasture-raised pork on the biosecurity options and we say, oh, you don't really have a lot of control, but there are a lot of things that we can do. We just have to, there just aren't as many videos, I suppose, highlighting that. So hopefully everybody got a bit of goodie. The yellow tracks were something that when I saw this video for the first time, I thought, oh, that's a really great way to say, yep, when somebody goes to grab some fuel for their vehicle and then come back to farm, what could they be bringing with them? So again, you're only as good as the sum of your parts. And so I just want to pop through a couple of these. So just showing how feed spills, these are all US photos obviously, but feed spills, how they can bring birds. You can have lots of bird nests around the area, birds inside the shed, which again, for PED, it takes the eraser on the end of your pencil. That's how much PED it takes to blow an entire sow farm and cause multi-million dollars worth of disease in the US. Rodent bait stations, so checking them and making sure that they aren't becoming rodent nests because we haven't put rodent bait in them frequent enough. This is a farm that they were quite proud they had their bird netting up, but again, if bird netting has holes in it, it's not very effective. And I thought this was quite useful. I actually brought some of this back with me from the US when I came back. So this is something that if I'm ever out on farm with you, I'm more than happy to do this for you just to see how you're doing on biosecurity. So on the left side, this is one of my sow farms back in the States. So on the left side, this is our Danish entry bench, and the kind of where the paint has worn off the floor here. This is what we would call the dirty side of the bench. So I walked out from the parking lot and I'm walking towards the bench. As you saw in the video, you would then sit down on the bench and take your shoes off, place them on, we have the rack here, and swing your legs across. So in that video, what it was trying to highlight to you is, hey, make sure you don't put your socks down or your feet down on the dirty side of the floor because that defeats the purpose, right? So this on the right side is just some little powder that you can use. It's quite common in schools for training hand washing. But you can sprinkle this on the floor and it only shows up with ultraviolet light. And then just so you know, it's not harmful for your skin. It's kind of like just like a plastic consistency. And then I didn't tell the farms and I scored them. So I went to all of my sow farms and I showed what was on the clean side of their bench. So this is after they swung their feet across. I said, if this was virus, you can see how many footprints made it across and you can actually track it as I moved through the farm. So this is kind of like the second video I showed you with the yellow lines showing disease movement. I could follow these footprints all the way through. This is the third image here is the kind of where you would change clothes for the shower, so on the dirty side of the shower. And then right up to the shower, we see a very solid footprint. And then what was quite sad was these next photos, these are now on the clean side of the shower. So this shows that people either did not do a very good job of showering or they just walked through the shower and said, you know what, I'm not going to shower today, I'm running late, whatever the case was, and they just stepped through. So, but you can just see, even though that was a very fine coating of powder, and they had lost some all the way, you know, on the dirty side, all the way, the hallway, the dirty side of the shower, look how much of it tracked through to the clean side. Now, of course, they put socks on after this, so I wasn't able to continue tracking it. But the point is that you're only as good as the sum of your parts. So even if you have a shower in play, if you aren't using the shower or your staff are already trained, oh, it's okay to walk through for now, we don't have ASF in the country, A, what other things could you be dragging through? But then B, when ASF does hit, will they remember to shower 100% of the time? Or will that culture have been in place that, oh, it's okay, I can walk through, ASF isn't near us, but what could they be dragging through to your piggery? So, yep, so that's the end of my talk. Right at 3 o'clock. Happy to answer any questions. I know a lot of these things are US specific, but they're very, very easy to implement. And I'm certainly willing to help address any questions or workarounds to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bree. I'm open for questions. Please use your keyboard to send them in. But while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I'll ask both Chris and Bree a question. And my question is, if we did find ASF in Australia, what's the first most significant thing that you would do?
I think for me, Ross, seeing the impact that truck washers and truck ovens have had in the US is pretty important, I think. And I think I'd be implementing them. I mean, I'd be trying to implement them now, to tell you the truth. I mean, we have probably, you know, 6 to 8 key, you know, large abattoirs around the country. They, for under $3 million, probably $2.5 million, we could put one in at every single large abattoir and just significantly reduce our risk of carting something back from an abattoir. So, I think when you look at that, so it was $2.5 million, and we sell 5 million pigs a year. I'm sure there'd be some support out there through government and industry and through producers to do it. I mean, we're talking 10 cents a pig over 5 years to put something in place that would significantly reduce the risk of spreading various viruses around the country in the event that we did get one.
I would second that, Ross. With seeing how PED moves through the U.S., and again, it's a mechanically transmitted disease. When I came to Australia, that was I've been here for 7 months now, right? But when I first came here, I was questioning Chris all these different things, trying to get acclimated, and the lack of truck washes was probably one of the more concerning things to me from a disease risk. There's things you can get around with the shower in, shower out, right? It's obviously ideal to have it, but the biggest risk you have is a dirty trailer. You have no control over that, and it backing up, you're going to be penalized for someone else's disease, right? So either, if you can work around downtime or washes, that's probably the biggest opportunity for me, I see.
There's no question that PED set the US on a path of scrupulous hygiene with respect to trucking. We've certainly seen PRRS and its impact on the US and the impact globally. Chris, what's the view on African swine fever spread in semen? Does it happen?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of any evidence, Ross, that shows that ASF is spread through semen. So certainly, if there was a case in Australia, then if we could isolate boar studs so that they maintained, basically as compartmentalisation, isolated studs, and then to continue supplying semen, I don't see where there's a real risk from the semen. There'd be risk potentially from vehicles moving around. But as Bree said, that's why most semen deliveries, if not all semen deliveries, are away from the piggeries in the US. So, yeah, that's basically where I sit on that. How about yourself? Are you aware of any evidence to suggest that ASF spread in semen?
In 1985, Thacker and others in a paper alluded to the possibility, but when you go and read the paper, it was exactly that. They had a thought bubble, but there was no data at all to support their conclusions. And globally, that was there's been constant research on African swine fever since then. Indeed, since 1921, and nobody has come up with the suggestion that African swine fever is spread by this route. At the same time, we've found that classical swine fever can be spread by semen, and indeed PRRS is spread by semen, and possibly even foot and mouth disease, but relatively few of the others. So I think your position is absolutely sound, Chris, and I think AI is a safe way of moving genes. The argument that we often have in this country, though, I believe, relates to fences, and both you and Bree have covered that very well. But we still have farms that, for whatever reason, cannot seem to bring themselves to define their perimeter. You have a comment on that?
Yeah, I think there's been healthy discussion on some of the ASF talks that we've been on. I don't think that it's I hope I don't misspeak. I don't think it's the producers are unwilling to put fences up, but it is a real cost, and I'm just an unbiased person looking at this from the outside, right? But it's easy to say, go put a fence up, but I'm hoping that in Australia, across the board, regardless of what state you're in, there's very clear if there's funding available, or that's something that Chris can obviously speak to more. But yeah, I would be surprised if anyone was unwilling to put a fence up. It's more of do producers feel like we've given you enough? We as an industry, we've shared enough knowledge to say what type of fence to put up. So obviously, burying it slightly, right? Because pigs are going to root, they're not going to jump over. But then also, has the government or any entity provided some kind of supplemental funding for that fence?
I think any clean dirty lines is really critical, Ross, that they're clearly defined and that behaviours reflect those clear dirty lines. You know, so I don't think it really matters, you know, what they are, whether it's just a drainage system or whether it's a full showering. I mean, at the end of the day, it's compliance, and 100% compliance is what needs to happen. So I think some of the stuff that Breeze talked about around the UV dust and stuff like that, just to continually demonstrate that what a real clean dirty line is and how much compliance there is. I think that's a simple thing that we can do to improve a biosecurity culture.
Excellent. Well, on my screen, I have no more questions, and so it's time to finish. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar. Next week, we have our third webinar, which will come to us from Regina Fogarty, who is going to talk about what happens if ASF gets into the country and what we're going to do about it. Our audience, will be able to review the previous webinars online, and this one will be up soon. Please remember, when you finish, to fill out the exit survey. It's important for us to find out how we've gone today, and it only takes a couple of minutes. Thank you and good afternoon.